Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Stephen Whiteman. I'm Senior Lecturer in Asian Art at the University of Sydney and the convener of the Sydney Asian Art Series. Thank you all for coming. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land upon which we gather, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and paying my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. As we come together to share our research and learn from one another, I also wish to acknowledge the Indigenous practices of teaching and learning that are central to the history, present, and future of this country. Thank you all for coming today to the first event of the 2018 Sydney Asian Art Series. We have a wonderful series planned for you this year. I hope you'll agree. And before we turn to our speaker this afternoon, Professor Winnie Wong from the University of California, Berkeley, I want to take a brief moment to tell you about some of the coming attractions. The Sydney Asian Art Series brings together 4 leading figures from across the worlds of Asian art to Sydney each year for a program of public talks and seminars. Last year, in Beyond the Studio, Context of Asian Art, we looked beyond the individual hand of the master artist to explore the many different factors that shape art's creation. This year's program, titled Uncertain Objects, Trajectories of Asian Art, continues in this vein. This year, we will be looking at different cases of art production and art objects and artists that are mobile, moving beyond the notion of art made in Asia as being of any one country or of any one place and time, to understand its art and its afterlives as it moves throughout the early modern and contemporary world. We have a wonderful program, I think, that begins with Winnie Wong today. Next month, we will be visited by Ajay Sinha from the United States, a scholar of South Asian photography and film. On the 23rd, you can come to a film series event here in the Domain Theatre, where he will be screening and talking about the film Bombay Talkies. And on the 29th, there will be an evening lecture at the University of Sydney. And you can read more about all of these events on the website of Power Publications or the Power Institute, which is powerpublications.com.au there, and also on the website of the Art Gallery of New South Wales. And then in August, we'll be visited by Tim Screech of SOAS at the University of London. Professor Screech is a specialist in early modern Japan and will be speaking about the contacts between the English East India Company and Japan and the mobility of Japanese prints, which came to be extremely important in emerging notions of modernism, Victorian modernism in Europe, of course. And then in October, Professor Nancy of the University of Binghamton will be here. Professor is a specialist in the early modern Indian Ocean world, and she will be talking about objects made in Japan that we traditionally associate with Japan, but which circulated throughout the early modern Indian Ocean all the way to the Middle East as objects of gift and exchange. So I think this is a really great program, and I'm really pleased that you all have come today and hope to see many of you again over the course of this year. A brief word about the Sydney Asian Art Series. The Sydney Asian Art Series, and I want to thank our sponsors. First, Viz Asia, the Viz Asia Council, who are connected with the Art Gallery of New South Wales and support important programming in Asian art here at the gallery. The Chinese Studies Centre at the University of Sydney, whose Deputy Director, Olivier Krischer, will in a moment introduce Professor Wong. And also the Power Institute, for which I serve as Deputy Director. The Power Institute is a center for art history and public programming in art history and visual culture located at the University of Sydney. I especially want to thank the staffs and directors of these various institutions. A great number of people go into making this series each year happen. And thank you to all of them for their generous giving of their time and energy. And so, without further ado, on to the almost to the main event of the afternoon. First to Olivier Krischer of the Chinese Studies Center, who will introduce Winnie Wong. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. So as you just heard, my name is Olivier Krischer. I'm the Deputy of China Studies Center, and we're very happy to be co-presenting another talk in the Asia Sydney Asian Art series. And today, I think we're really in for a treat. I can say that as by happy coincidence, I'm also an art historian by trade and interested in various issues which intersect with what Winnie Wong will be talking about today. Winnie Wong is professor in the Department of Rhetoric at UC Berkeley, and her work in a very broad sense deals with issues of artistic authorship, but that also deals with issues such as fakes and forgeries. And she's probably best known for her 2014 book, Van Gogh on Demand, The Ready-Made in China, which won a very prestigious prize in 2015, the Joseph Levinson Prize for Best Book on Post-1900 China. Recently, she's also been the co-editor of a book in 2016, Learning from Shenzhen, which, to give you an idea of the breadth of her work and interests, is more of a kind of cultural, sociological, and anthropological look at Shenzhen, the city, which features heavily in the first book that she published in 2014, which centers on Dafan, a village in Shenzhen. So today, I'm not going to say much more. I'm just very happy that we can see Winnie Wong in Sydney. Please welcome with me Professor Winnie Wong.
Is this on? Hello. Thank you, Stephen and Olivier, for your kind introductions. Thank you to Viz Asia and the Art Gallery for having me here today. Thank you to Mark and Stephen for your initial invitation. And thank you to many old friends and new friends in the audience who've made my week here so far the most fabulous time I think a person can have while working. My talk today is inspired by this little snippet in Michel Foucault's essay or lecture, What is an Author? And I'm giving it to you now just to have you meditate on it, and I will return to it only at the very end. So this is a little fragment that just says, if we are accustomed to presenting the author as a genius, as a perpetual surging of invention, it is because, in reality, we make him function in exactly the opposite fashion. A characteristically cryptic remark, I think, from Foucault that I hope you will think on, and I'll try to illuminate by the end. Okay? All right. Consider these two portraits, both of the same wryly smiling Chinese man. He is depicted in the unadorned coat of a commoner, but with the upturned sleeve and the relaxed pose of a more learned man. Painted before an unarticulated dark background, the sitter looks directly at the viewer. A light from one side highlights his warm and reassuring gaze. Such a pose would have been atypical of Chinese artistic conventions of the time, but it would have been quite conventional in European art, where it would have simply been called a half-length portrait in three-quarter view. To be matter-of-fact about it, what we have here is the exclusive representation of a sitter's head and shoulders, positioned so that he appears to be self-consciously aware that he is presenting his face live for his own depiction. In the terms of 18th and 19th century British culture, where portraiture was elevated above even history painting, what the painter has sought to portray here is character. As one late 18th century English artist manual explains, with the term character, we express the peculiar and distinguishing appearance of person, feature, and deportment, which is proper to any and to every individual. By character, we determine the sex, the time of life, the country or family, the mental disposition, the natural or acquired habit, and even frequently the possessions and pursuits of those with whom we are conversant. In other words, this kind of portraiture presents an individual as a possessive self, a persona constructed of fashion, property, and sociability, whose visual gaze is directed outward to a public viewer implied by the picture plane. In the European history of art, the emergence of these elements of self-conscious individuality in portraiture is often considered one of the products or symptoms of modernity. But such a visual form, with its rhetoric focused on facial lifelikeness and naturalism, was not very common in Chinese art of the time. Painters who painted faces accurately were certainly not new in China, but it was not a genre designed to convey the same meanings as in European portraiture. In the painting manuals of the Ming, facial portraits were equated with physiognomy and fortune-telling, and associated primarily with commemorative portraits of the dead, or so-called ancestor portraits. These were painted by professional painters, sometimes commissioned late in a person's life, or by viewing the corpse. Sometimes they were painted without looking upon the deceased, and instead created through conversation with the bereaved and the help of albums of facial types, such as this from this rarely preserved album. Unlike European post-Renaissance portraits, Chinese painters of ancestral portraits sought to create a likeness that accorded with the complete, timeless, distinguishing features of a person for the bereaved, rather than a momentary and fleeting facial expression in his or her life. In more artistic portraits, painters of faces were also professional painters and quite often hired by serious artists to fulfill this crafty component. This would be true even of the works at the Qing court, where a professional painter from Europe was specifically requested of the Jesuit mission. From Milan, they brought over Giuseppe Castiglione, who was treated by the court as a workshop specialist of the emperor's facial portraits, and requested to do just that in numerous collective works for the court, such as this very famous portrait of the Kangxi Emperor and his grandson, the future Qianlong Emperor. On the other hand, even among popular painters, faces were not necessarily needed to convey a portrait. Consider this wonderful one from the late 18th century, a historical portrait of the Tang poet Wang Wei by the professional painter Shang Guanzhou. This is all to say that the portrait we have here is to be distinguished from the Chinese conventions that preceded it, not only by medium, style, and technique with which it is painted, but also by the subtle ways in which it utilizes the human face to portray a subject. And yet, though what we have here is a painting which purports to portray a single individual at a single moment of his life, it is strangely doubled. For of course we have two paintings of the same man, of almost the same look, and of almost the same moment. True that in one, the figure sports a mustache, his eyes are less open, his cheeks a little ruddier, his smile a little more subdued, and in the background, a Qing official's cap with red tassels and white mother of pearl buttons signifying the low rank of 6th grade can be seen in the background. But otherwise, the two paintings are the same painting in that they are a repetition of the same composition, the same subject painted in the same manner, and or the same essential image. We might say they are two iterations of the same gao, or design, which I would like to suggest is quite different from saying that they are two instances of the same model, and perhaps still different from saying that they are two copies of the same original. The various ways of describing the relationship between these two paintings are, however, intimately tied up with characteristics we associate with modernism in the history of art. And they also define very practical differences between how a portrait and a copy of a portrait are painted. But it turns out these are not just portraits, but rather self-portraits. This we learn from an inscription found on the strainers. This is the back of this painting. So on the strainers of this painting, which is now in the Hong Kong Museum of Art, an English inscription on the upper register, left corner, reads Lam Hua, age 52, painted by himself, Canton, 1853. With this inscription, the portrait can now be identified, named as a self-portrait, attributed to a painter named Lam Hua, and dated to 1853. With it, we can also identify the other version of the painting, now held at the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, And this one can be loosely dated to the early 19th century because it looks as if Lam Hua appears to be slightly younger in this image. So this one is judged to be a little younger. It is as though we have accepted that this man took exactly the same position to sit while painting his portrait of himself, and that he did so at least twice in exactly the same way, years apart, even though, of course, no person can sit like this while painting himself, because obviously he would need to be holding a paintbrush. After all, the self-portrait is not a mirror, though it tricks us into believing so. In other words, the constructedness of these images revealed in its doubled existence should remind us that the painter himself has quite self-consciously and repeatedly produced these two images of himself, rather than painting himself as he appears in a single moment as the painting makes it appear. What we have here then is not an early example of a modern, in a European sense, portrait of a Chinese person. We also have here an example of a highly constructed modern artist's self-portrait genre by a Chinese painter. In that vein, consider how it compares to another artist's self-portrait painted 5 years later in 1858. This one is by the French neoclassical painter Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, who, while much more famous than Lam Hua, also made a living as a portraitist. The two artists have presented themselves in almost the same relaxed pose, in workmanlike layered winter dress, hands out but not at work. They lean back and hold the imagined viewer in a steady gaze, comfortable in their stature. Both are nearly monochrome paintings with a vivid note of a primary color, the blue cuff of Lam Hua's sleeve and the red rosette on the lapel of the neck. Both are also painted with the brushless naturalism so characteristic of the French neoclassical school, of which Ingres was the acknowledged master, and so uncharacteristic of the Chinese literati culture, which we might imagine Lam Hua was more familiar. So here, across a vast artistic cultural space, we have a near simultaneity of compositional convention and visual rhetoric. I say near simultaneity because Lam Hua's 1853 painting actually predates the great French master's painting by a few years, and if we are to date the younger portrait to the early 19th century, then perhaps Lam Hua anticipates Ingres by a couple of decades. So how did Lam Hua, a Chinese commoner living in a culturally peripheral port city of the late Qing, learn to paint, first in oil on canvas, then second within the conventions of portraiture, and thirdly to adopt the European practice of artists who depicted themselves self-consciously as professionals? Moreover, how did he come to inhabit these practices so well that his own self-portrait indeed anticipates a work of one of the most renowned European painters of the 19th century? Until recently, Western scholars had assumed that Lam Hua was the servant or student of George Chinnery, a British portraitist who worked for decades in India, then in 1825 moved to Macau, where he lived and worked until his death. This is one of his self-portraits. Today, we know that Lam Hua was a practicing oil on canvas painter with a healthy business years before Chinnery's arrival in Macau, and that quite soon after, Lam Hua's prices undercut Chinnery's several times over. The two are therefore now regarded more as competitors than teacher and pupil. Yet there must have been some contact between the two painters, for the elusive relationship between them is tantalizingly suggested by another doubling, a copy of Chinnery's self-portrait attributed to Lam Hua. A close look at these two paintings, which I was able to do only once in person, reveals two astonishingly similar surfaces. Indeed, they can be identified as paintings by Chinnery and Lam Hua only by their differently constructed wood supports. By my eye, Lam Hua's copy appeared painted a little more finely, with the face and textures slightly more modeled, while Chinnery's was painted in a sketchier hand and in thinner layers. But Lam Hua's version is so close to Chinnery's that it is impossible to believe that he did not see it in the original, and difficult to believe that it was not right before him while the copy was made. But what reason would Shinri have to give Long Kwa his own self-portrait to copy unless Long Kwa was Shinri's student, assistant, or ghost painter? Were they friends? Was it a joke? Absent further information, how can we even rule out the possibility that it wasn't Long Kwa who painted the portrait of Shinri and Shinri who made a copy after it? In sum, these three pairs of artist self-portraits by French, British, and Chinese portraitists represent three different relationships between the original and the copy. Long Kwa's work here is iterative, anticipatory, and repetitive, but also approximate, conventional, and exact. Together, all three pairs speak to a striking simultaneity of artist self-presentations in the mid-19th century, joining Long Kwa with Ang and Shinri in a shared visual culture of self-portraiture. Despite the great difference in art historical status among them, what is striking is how similar these paintings are, how much they share in style, technique, and composition, and how much the practice of portrait painting, even the self-portrait of a portrait painter, is performed in a global transcultural standard. When these paintings were made, in European artistic discourse, copying was only beginning to acquire the moralistic, culturalist, even racist significations it has today. Why do artists copy? Is copying learning? Is copying theft? Do Chinese copy more than Europeans? Is European culture more inventive and creative? Is Chinese culture more honorific and imitative? These are present-day questions that come together in the person of Long Kwa, who, as the most prominent of the early Chinese practitioners of European oil painting, is a prime candidate for exploring their origins. Yet these three instances of Long Kwa's practice suggest how complicated the issue already was. Is it possible for Long Kwa to have painted something more than once, but have been doing something other than what we now think of as copying? So, for the rest of my talk today, I'm going to explore these questions by taking an extremely close look at only one work attributed to Long Kwa. You'll see that in the process of understanding this work, we will have to question not only what kind of art Long Kwa produced and what kind of artist he was, but we will also need to question how we go about assigning the modern traits of individuality and authorship to a historical figure such as Long Kwa. Okay? So, in the 1980s, a London art dealer found in a private collection this painting. It is signed on the lower left surface, Long Kwa, and Long Kwa in Chinese and English. The painting probably looks very familiar to you because it is, of course, a copy or reduction after Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres' Le Grand Odalisque of 1814, reduced in size, painted in reverse, and in a pink palette. Looking at this painting, I think the first and most obvious question is, why pink? Or, to put it more fully, how did Long Kwa, who could never have seen the masterpiece in Paris at the Salon of 1819, nor when it was exhibited again at the World's Fair of 1855, manage to achieve such exemplary closeness to the original and yet to alter it in such a dramatic way? Was the pink palette a mistake, a client's request, a creative innovation, or a wry appropriation? To land upon any one of these explanations I'd like to propose requires entirely different figurations of Long Kwa as a 19th century Chinese oil painter situated in the port of Canton and bounded by the site and conditions of his practice. It would depend on what we might guess about the extent of his artistic and client networks, the artistic knowledges and discourses available to him, his skill, and his position vis-a-vis the source of the painting which he was copying, 19th century Paris. But before we consider these questions, let's take a few steps back and reconsider our assumptions. For to call our Long Kwa a copy of an original would be the first mistake. Because in the practice of the neoclassical artist Ingres, what did or did not constitute originality has long been debated. As the art historian Rosalind Krauss once very provocatively put it, Ingres was a trafficker in the copy, producing version after version of essentially the same picture, sometimes exactly the same picture. Indeed, of this odalisque, there are at least 5 other copies painted by Ingres between 1817 and 1829, This practice was not at all uncommon for him, as he, with his assistants, seemed to have produced 7, of which I can only find 4, oil replicas of Paolo and Francesca, 4 of the famous Raphael in the Fornarina, 19 of the Duc d'Orléans, and so on and so forth. Some scholars regard Ingres' habit of repetitively copying all of his major subjects an intentional practice in the pursuit of perfection, an obsessive compulsion of genius. Rosalind Krauss countered that what is striking about these works is precisely not the evident refinement of the conception, but the wooden repetitiveness of the idea. Indeed, as you can see, each instance of the odalisque exhibits compositional variations we might call incidental. The peacock fan is replaced by the fly whisk sometimes. The bed cushion with the pool of water, the pipe and the brazier here come and go. If these variations represent a linear progression towards the perfection of a composition, why are the differences so minor and so inconsequential, even nitpicky? Does our notion of the creative process only entail the perpetual surging of invention? What about crabby mistakes and pointless revisions? And so our pink painting, a replica not by the artist himself, but a replica among many nonetheless, seems suddenly not to be the product of an essentially Chinese practice, but rather quite fittingly embedded within a certain Western preoccupation with imitating the past and replicating itself. This is manifest not only in Ingres' painting production, but in his lifelong engagement with printmaking. A devoted student of European classical works that he knew through engraved reproductions, Ingres engaged fitfully throughout his career with Burin engraving, with lithography, and even tentatively embraced early photography. Of the odalisque, we thus have more than a few prints authorized by Ingres or associated with him to consider. We even have this 1858 photograph, a carbon print of the painting, as well as this photograph of one of the engravings. Ingres worked closely with the famous Burin engraver Calamata, with whom he envisioned a relationship such as his idol Raphael had with Raimondi, and also with the editor Goupil, who by 1858 owned the 1814 odalisque canvas himself. As one might suspect, Ingres assiduously involved himself in the plate preparation process, marking and tracing proofs, and thereby making continuous demands for modifications to the exasperation and costs of the publishers. Hence, the historian Stephen Bann argued that Ingres quite consistently showed himself to be incapable of treating his own earlier works as over and done with. Now, at least one of the prints of the odalisque from 1825 is thought by some scholars to be by Ingres himself. This print is inscribed Ingres 1825 here. It appears to be based on the oil reduction now at the Musée d'Angers, but not all of the details match precisely, and indeed the print appears to introduce this round as opposed to square smoking brazier. It has been argued that no one but Ingres himself could have taken the liberty of making such an alteration in the print, but of course this is an assumption built around the inviolability of an original, an expectation that loses its force when the author himself appears not so much to revere it. I would also hasten to add, can an inscription, presumably inscribed on the plate by the engraver or drawn on the stone by the lithographer, really be called a signature? To the contemporary eye, here I try to draw lines between differences. To the contemporary eye, trying to work out a narrative of linear intentions during a century, as Andrew Shelton has called it, obsessed with progress, what we would have here is a distinctly uncooperative corpus of prints and paintings of the odalisque, each inconsequentially different, and each exhibiting minor alterations that we might derive from one another, but none somehow leading to an ultimate work, nor at all faithful to its immediate or first referent. Moreover, we could as much attribute these minute changes, and indeed diminishes in size and quality, to the master himself, or to his assistants, or to the work of engravers, lithographers, editors, and publishers. And we haven't even begun to consider the demands of patrons and clients. One can readily see how, in trying to match detail against detail, signature against signature, provenance against provenance, attribution against attribution, things and intentions could get troublesome, if not downright contentious, as the difference between a source and a copy gets increasingly blurred. And so, to call our pink and reverse L'Emploi a copy of a painting is the second mistake, because of course it was not painted from the oil original or originals, as it were, but after one or more of the prints. And of these prints, the painting appears to most closely match an 1826 lithograph by Jean-Pierre Sude. The dimensions are nearly identical, and all the painted details, including the peacock fan, the still life in the foreground, the belt, and even the nipple, match the print precisely. Sude was called the translator by appointment of Ingres, meaning he was contracted to produce lithographs. From 1826 to 1833, he produced at least 3 lithographs of the Odalisque, 2 of which were also exhibited at the Salon. Whatever the status of these prints for Ingres' creative process, there was, of course, also a commercial motivation. Whereas he had sold the 1814 Odalisque painting for 6,000 francs, he sold the lithographic rights for 24,000 francs. Notably, the still life introduced in the foreground of the Sude lithograph, which does not appear in other prints or paintings, seemed to come from one of Ingres' unfinished drawings. But it is debatable whether this drawing pre- or post-dates the Odalisque of 1814. In other words, it is not at all clear whether the drawing precedes a print, nor even which is of greater importance, and hence, if we are hoping to seek an original of the Odalisque from which a reproductive copy is made, we would again be frustrated. It seems reasonable to say, then, that in the practice of an artist such as Ingres, painting and repainting in oil on canvas seems to be only one part of a very large transformative affair of multimedia transfer, of drawing and redrawing, printing and reprinting, working and reworking. It also evolved alongside intaglio and planographic print technologies, which entailed a close interaction with assistants, engravers, lithographers, and publishers. As a result, our modern expectations of originality and individual authorship, based upon a hierarchy of media and the precedence of quality, are thus frustrated here. We might presume, for example, that the source of the black and white tonality of Sude's own lithograph comes from Ingres' famous Odalisque en grisaille, the monochrome repetition, probably painted by Ingres and listed in his own catalogue of his work. Yet isn't it hard to imagine that the painting itself wasn't influenced by, if not a derivation, of the lithographic prints Ingres had made of that same picture? To reiterate then, assumptions about the hierarchy of media, genre, and scale that begins with a large oil on canvas original and ends in a small and faithful mechanical reproduction, a print, is complicated by actual practices of 19th century artists, of which Ingres was quite exemplary. And thus, before we call our L'Emploi a copy, it would do to remember that its reference original was neither singular, unique, individual, nor unrepeatable, nor was a print from which it might have come itself the result of an unaffected mode of copying, a merely mechanical reproduction of a single original. To quote Rosalind Krauss again, what if there were no beginning uncorrupted by a prior instance? And what if this somewhere, this localizable origin, were fractured at its very core, and thus were always already divided? This is indeed the question at hand, but in my mind it applies not only to the central works of the Western canon, but to the contemporaneous replicas, repetitions, and reductions made on the distant shores of southern China at the port of Canton. So, while Ingres was famous for his strikingly realistic portraits, his Odalisque corpus reminds us how he utilized those same painterly techniques to invent and imagine and to convince the viewer of the reality of an utterly imagined person. The two sides of Ingres speak aptly to the classic operations of Orientalism and the ways in which European culture visualized its opposites. Such imagined depictions of the Orient is, of course, devoid of the character it sought in itself. The Oriental is instead pictured to be not modern but fantastic, not male but effeminate, not a self-possessed subject of property and clothing and habit, but nude, distorted, and objectified. The existence of a figure like Lan Kwa reminds us that the so-called Orient, so dramatically evoked as a counterpart to the European, was at the same time also making the same kinds of pictures. Now, the city of Canton, where Lan Kwa worked, served as the exclusive port of Chinese trade with the West from about 1760 to 1842. Here, a changing guild of 13 Chinese merchant firms held the exclusive right to trade with all foreign merchants and national trading companies, such as the Dutch and British East India companies. The trade was concentrated in the major commodities of tea, porcelain, and raw silk, but the wealth and contact brought together in the Canton of this period also supported a luxury trade in many kinds of objects, including paintings like this one. The American missionary Samuel Wells Williams estimated in the mid-19th century that as many as 2,000 to 3,000 painters were at work in the immense picture business of Canton, and by the 1760s, paintings on paper were already being packed in the hundreds and shipped to England. At present, we are still trying to get a handle on the overlooked volumes and volumes of paintings painted in Canton in oil, watercolor, or gouache, on canvas, paper, pith paper, ivory, or glass, now residing in collections around the world. As a portraitist, Lan Kwa was working in only one of many genres and media of painting production of Canton export painting. I like to divide these into three broad categories. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, Canton's painters ably produced, first, paintings that appear naively Chinese and that would fit well within European expectations of awkward Chinese attempts at naturalism, chiaroscuro, linear perspective, and composition. Second, they also produce works painted from life or from prints that are indistinguishable from professional works painted by their contemporaries in the West, and indeed were described by Europeans as extremely fine. Third, Canton's painters also produced paintings that were sold to Western buyers in other ports of the maritime world, such as Manila and Peru, as the naive works of those other non-Western cultures. In other words, it would seem that Canton's painters were as capable of producing works judged fully European, even as they were of producing works that appeared by European eyes, awkwardly Chinese or deficiently non-European. Lan Kwa belonged to my second category, a Canton painter whose works were regarded uniformly by his European clientele to be as fine as those of his European contemporaries. Here is, for example, a tiny sampling of portraits attributed to him. His portraits were exhibited at the Royal Academy in London in 1835, in Paris in 1846, in New York in 1841, at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts and the Boston Athenaeum in 1851. Thus, he was quite possibly the first Chinese painter painting in the Western manner to exhibit in the West. By the 1830s, his three-story studio, located on a street between the foreign factories, had become almost a necessary stop for French and Anglophone visitors to Canton. From their travel accounts, we know that Lan Kwa advertised himself as a portraitist in both the English and the Chinese fashion, though we have not yet found a painting in ink on paper by Lan Kwa, and everyone should be looking. We know that both Western and Chinese merchants sat for their portraits in his third-floor studio, and that on his second floor, between 6 to 20 assistants or pupils or perhaps collaborators worked in oil, watercolor, and gouache. We also know that he had quite a collection of prints. Said Charles Lavallee, member of the French mission in 1850, quote, "It would take a day to pass in review of the picture, rolls of drawings, albums, and heaped in the shop of Lan Kwa." Said the Englishman Toogood Downing, of the copies being painted from prints in the studio, quote, "Their coloring especially is excellent, and considering that this is necessarily left to their own judgment, often displays considerable taste in the harmony of the tints, which tells us that it was almost always black and white European prints which the Canton painters had access." But the best source of information we have on Lan Kwa still comes from the two inscriptions we have already discussed on the self-portrait. Recall that in the upper left corner, we have the following in English and handwritten script: Lan Kwa, age 52, painted by himself, Canton, 1853. Now, on the lower register, we have the following written in Cantonese: 寫相喺南瓜52歲自己照鏡寫的。Note that the inscription is written in the third person, which suggests strongly that this inscription was not written by Lam Qua. I would also like to draw your attention to the two characters used for Lam Qua here. A ling or lam with a mouth radical here, and a qua, also with a mouth radical. These two Chinese characters are fitting for the painter we have come to know in English records variously as Lam Qua, or as Madame Tussauds put it, Lam Qua. A name in a pidgin language derived from an amalgamation of English, Portuguese, Cantonese, and Fujianese that served as a sing-song lingua franca between Chinese and foreigners in Guangzhou. The qua used in the names of both Canton painters and merchants is an invented honorific, possibly derived from the Fujianese pronunciation of the word guan, meaning official. It has also been speculated that the painters adopted the same honorific homonym in pidgin, but would not have presumed to call themselves merchants or officials, so we end up with the onomatopoeic character gua, written in this variant form, which I can explain more later. I myself think that this character was even perhaps also a vernacular reference to the sing-song and nonsensical quality of pidgin used to converse with the barbarian foreigners, a sort of gua gua gyu. Based on the handful of inscriptions found on the paintings and in Western records, the Lam Qua name has been associated by 20th century scholars with a family of painters, artists, illustrators by the last name Guan, but a different Guan. Based on the Chinese family genealogy and a county gazette, the Lam Qua of this self-portrait can be linked either with the Chinese name Guan Zuoling or Guan Qiaochang, though both might be names for the same person, as learned Chinese men have many names. This is why it makes sense to write Lam Qua's name in Chinese, as the inscriber of the self-portrait does, with the invented pseudo-characters Lam with a mouth radical, right? And Hua. Since this is a Cantonese retransliteration of the pidgin trade name Lam Qua. Make sense? All this is to say that the Chinese characters which appear on the lower left corner of our pink odalisque are not the same characters that appear on the back of the self-portrait. Most importantly, the Ling on the odalisque is given as a regular character, as though it were Lam Qua's surname or given name. This is a clear misunderstanding of how that trade name operated and how it came to be written in Chinese. Even if we assume that Lam Qua's Chinese name was Guan Zuoling, and that Lam Qua derived from the last character of his name, the Ling used here, which is otherwise a common last name or given name, is not the Ling of Guan Zuoling. In other words, whoever wrote this name on the odalisque has mistaken Lam to be Lam Qua's last name. Therefore, we can be quite sure that though this signature has been put in the customary place of a signature for a Western painting, it most certainly is not an autographic one. Okay, so the specter of a false signature is perhaps raising in your mind the possibility that a pink Chinese copy of Le Grand Odalisque, decades before the commercial availability of color photography, a nude painted in China more than a century before the practice of life drawing is even debated in China, is perhaps a bit too perfect, a bit impossible. Such a thought perhaps renders the pink palette itself now somehow wry, somehow too good to be true, like an insider's joke that is far too modern. After all, could a Canton painter who never saw the original in color really imagine how the original worked? But then again, why couldn't the painter of this portrait, of the merchant Mo Qua, not be quite familiar with the luminosity of pearls, of the brilliance of peacock feathers, the texture of fur pelt, and after all, aren't curtains in Western style paintings not always somehow reddish, as they always are in the portraits of Shinri? All that would be left would be to render the strange object, the pipe, the cushion, the belt, the still life, and the fan, all in the same approximate pale yellow. So perhaps the third mistake is to presume that the painting was painted by the same person who signed it with the name of the painter who painted the painting. This is indeed not a signature, but perhaps more akin to an inscription, much like the Ang 1825, which appears on the Delpech print. After all, since even Lang Qua's own self-portrait was not signed by him, we have no idea whether any of the inscriptions on any of the paintings attributed to Lang Qua are indeed signatures in any autographic sense. For example, here are two other Lang Quas, and also with different characters, that each predate and post-date the working life of the Lang Qua we have been talking about. Nor do we have any evidence that the autographic signature held any significance for him. The name functions, in other words, as a trade name, one that was possibly used by a number of painters whose identity and relationship to each other we might begin to trace out if we weren't so obsessed with the search for an individual. Ultimately, we must grant that, though there was a single historical individual to whom we could, for a particular period, assign the trade name Lang Qua, neither is there any reason to think that his corpus nor practice corresponds to the romantic myths of individuality or originality that not even the great Ang comfortably adhered to. Under such circumstances, does it even matter who signed our pink painting, even if it was signed incorrectly? So perhaps a final mistake would be to mistake this painting for a copy. For in addition to all of these conditions of non-authorship, we have, least of all, any reason to believe that the person who was, or was not, working under the trade name Lang Qua knew or cared that the painting was a copy after Ang's 1814 painting. Hence, to mark or measure its difference or distance from the original is rather preposterous, for it seems neither originator nor copyist operated in an artistic discourse which demanded either the singularity of a work or its mere reproduction. That is, neither the source material nor its distant reworking operated within the purest apparatus of original and copy that we have retrospectively come to expect. All right, in conclusion, so what do we really know of Lang Qua? Or rather, what can we know of him? The answer would seem to be not very much. We know that at least one painter existed in Canton who was referred to in a contact language by the trade name of Lang Qua, that he painted many portraits for Europeans and Chinese, and at least 3, this is the third one, of himself. Although we know quite vividly what his European clients thought of him, and we even know quite vividly how he wished to portray himself visually, we cannot securely say what his names were, where he was born, how he learned to paint, whether he regarded himself as an artist, what he thought about being a pioneer in a wholly foreign artistic medium, nor whether he even regarded it as a kind of art. By the same token, though we do know he painted many portraits, and though we have today many paintings on which is written the names that sometimes refer to him, we do not have any examples of this name being written by himself on such a painting in the way a signature would. Moreover, we do not have what would have been the equivalent in the Chinese tradition, any seals, calligraphy, or poetry that might detail his voice, thinking, a hand behind any given work. Finally, of the works we do have, many exist in multiples, in ways that lead us to question whether the works originated, if they are copies, and if so, of what sort. So in his 1969 lecture, Michel Foucault, what is an author? Michel Foucault gave us the critical terms for untangling these impossible relationships, or rather he gave us a roadmap for how to avoid creating an ideological figure, the author, out of misrepresenting an historical one. The case of Lang Qua is a perfect example of our collective desire to create a named signature artist out of scant historical facts surrounding a nearly anonymous figure. The name Lang Qua has functioned as an author name, fulfilling an author function that attempts to bring China into a Eurocentric global history of artistic modernity. Today, many excellent early 19th century Canton expert portraits are attributed to Lang Qua, but even if such an attribution were accurate, what would it really mean? As I have suggested here, the designation L'Enquois and the works that have been attributed to that name may have very little to do with the person or persons who may or may not have applied oil paint on canvas to make these pictures. Foucault observed that our desire to police the author function was a way of dealing with our fear of the proliferation of meaning, a way by which in our culture, one limits, excludes, and chooses, in short, by which one impedes the free circulation, the free manipulation, the free composition, decomposition, and recomposition of fiction. So what if we were to heed the suggestion and instead look for actions, gestures, and moments of this freedom? What kind of rich historical possibilities might we find instead passing through a persona such as some might have called L'Enquois? I'd like to conclude with the outlines of just one such possibility. It is drawn from an anecdote recorded by Jules Itier. He was a French customs officer and amateur daguerreotypist who took the earliest surviving photographs of China when he was in Canton only 5 years after the invention of the technology. This is a self-portrait he later made of himself in Chinese dress. In his published account of his visit to China, he wrote a long journal entry detailing his meeting with a painter named L'Enquois in November 1844, which I am going to quote at length here. I have not yet mentioned that I had, about 8 days ago, a visit from the painter L'Enquois. Spurred by the desire to see the admirable instrument that draws all by itself, and that all the painters of Canton were so preoccupied with, he examined my daguerreotype with great care, and upon his request, I took a portrait of him, which I immediately offered to him. He seemed quite enchanted by this courtesy, and had forgotten about it all until one day he was announced and presented me with a lined leather box, just like the one in which I had placed his daguerreotype portrait. He asked me to accept this token of his appreciation. I was happily surprised in opening this box to find inside it a miniature portrait of L'Enquois, painted by himself on ivory, with a perfection and finish that would garner the admiration of our own best artists. And curiously, L'Enquois had taken for model of his portrait the daguerreotype, and moreover, this painting was remarkable for the vigor of its relief. It is impossible, one must concede, to demonstrate a greater courtesy or savoir-vivre. To be sure, a people with such traits can rightly pass for being civilized. Itier's daguerreotype of L'Enquois and the portrait L'Enquois gave to him is not yet found today. But we might imagine what they look like by comparing another daguerreotype by Itier of a Canton merchant's family with, of course, L'Enquois' self-portrait. So how can we interpret this wonderful exchange between a painter and a daguerreotypist? It seems that after requesting a daguerreotype portrait of himself from Itier, L'Enquois decided to repaint the image, or something like it, on ivory, producing in effect a self-portrait after a photograph as opposed to a mirror. By repainting by hand an image produced by machine, L'Enquois has decomposed the daguerreotype, disaggregating its precious surface and its flatness, and disrupting the machine's self-perpetuating image. L'Enquois returned to Itier a recomposed portrait in the form of a finished miniature on the translucent precious material of ivory. This he painted in a manner that was, according to Itier, remarkable for the vigor of its relief, or precisely what a daguerreotype cannot achieve. Finally, L'Enquois enclosed the painting in a leather case, purposefully to resemble the box Itier gave him his daguerreotype in, equating the two objects in status, scale, and value as gifts. Here, in other words, is yet another doubling associated with the figure named as L'Enquois, and here again is evidence of his fascination with the reversals and labyrinths of self-portraiture. Here he has purposefully set out to make a picture of himself, painted by himself, but not made from the original himself. Why did L'Enquois choose to reciprocate Itier's courtesy by repainting the portrait of himself rather than to paint a reciprocal portrait of Itier, as fellow artists might give to one another? Did he think he needed to prove to Itier that he could produce an image as well as the one drawn by his machine? Or perhaps he understood very well what the function of an artist's self-portrait was, the ability to represent oneself through the constructedness of an immediate image, that is, to construct oneself as author. Encountering the machine that would replace his skill, he perhaps decided to make sure to demonstrate quite a different one, the savoir-vivre of a civilized person. In other words, I'm proposing that here was indeed a moment of free circulation and recomposition of the image that runs counter to the story of modernity driving relentlessly towards fulfilling that universal human desire for realist pictures. Instead, what we have here is an artistic response to the daguerreotype that is social and gestural, that while conforming to the European notion of civilizational progress, plays freely with the mechanics of image making. Finally, by retransforming an image from the new technology into a handmade painting on ivory, Longqua reminds us that in the early years of its use, the daguerreotype was by far the lesser medium when it came to the realism that painters could easier produce, and that long before the invention of the machine was already and easily present in the artist himself. Thus, one could say that in his meeting with this new technology, Longqua decided to repaint, retransform, and return rather than to imitate or to copy. Of course, we can't know for sure until we see the original. But in the case of Longqua, that is not something we can be sure we have ever seen before. Thank you.